Thank you and welcome for joining us for the Utah Historical Society's Perspective Lecture Series. As 2025 marks the 80th anniversary at the end of World War II, today's lecture is part of a six-part series that seeks to answer the question, what was Utah's World War II experience, by examining this topic from a variety of perspectives. Today's lecture will examine the complexities of the Japanese-American experience during World War II, marked by uncertainty that included forced relocations, internment, loyalty oaths, and military service. Presenting this perspective is Hanako I'm going to say this right, Wakatsuki-Chong, and Erica Nadeau-Campbell. Hanako is the executive director of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon in Portland and is professionally trained as a public historian, political scientist, and museologist. She holds a BA in history and a BS in political science from Boise State University, as well as an MA in museum studies for Johns Hopkins University, and previously worked as the superintendent of the Honolulu National Historic Site. Erica was born in Portland, Oregon, and grew up next door to her grandma and grandpa Nadeau, who were important business and civic leaders in the Japanese American community there. She is the author of Portland's Audacious Champion, documenting her grandfather's story and legacy. I will now turn the time over to Hanako and Erica, who will present their lecture, after which they will be able to take your questions in the Q&A. So as we go along, use the chat or use the Q&A function, and then they'll be able to answer your questions at the end. So Hanako, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Eliza. So right now I'm gonna switch over to the share screen. So give me a second to get that all figured out. We're gonna do this. Presentation mode. Okay. Does that look, could everyone see what I have? Can I get a confirmation from Eliza or Erica? Thank you.
Yeah,
okay.
looks great.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for having us here today. We're excited to kind of, tell this history about the Japanese American incarceration and how it impacted Utah as well through a specific family's journey. So this is going to be the overview for today. I have a quick film. It's like more of a music video that's going to take us from immigration to incarceration. And then we'll just kind of go through quickly. It's going to be a quick survey on the Japanese American incarceration history itself. Then I'm going to turn it over to Erica to kind of talk about her family's journey, and then we could do some Q&A. So with that, we'll get started with this video.
one day you will follow at the sound of laughter. One day we'll fall in love.
Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed that and hopefully you guys heard it as well because it was kind of weird. I couldn't hear it. But I was just watching it. But just want to let you know that was actually created by the National Park Service back in 2020 and was reused again back in 2023 for the 80th anniversary of Executive Order 9066. So I'll talk a little bit more about the executive order later on, but just want to give credit where it's due. So yeah, and that, I got permission to use it for some of my presentations. So if you guys are interested in having access to it, I could definitely send you a link where this is part of a larger program that was done in 2023. But as we move on towards our presentation, I just want to talk about terminology. And one of the things I do want to just let you guys know, I can't really see any chats or anything, so I'm going to just kind of power through. But if something does come up, if Eliza or Brandy could jump on, that'll be great. But yeah, so you're gonna hear me when I talk about the incarceration using different words. And the reason why is because internment actually has a definition that under the Geneva Convention means it's only people who you're at war with, you could intern them, where it means that you could separate them where they're not US citizens and they're citizens of the country that you're at war with and remove them from the population. So that's what an internment is. But with the Japanese American incarceration, two-thirds of the people who are forcibly removed from their homes, and that's about like, I think right now the count is 125,384 people that's been documented. Most of them were actually American-born citizens. So internment doesn't quite categorize the larger experience unless we're talking about the first generation immigrants from Japan, where that is an internment, but for the larger concept of this incarceration, it was an incarceration. And this has been dialogue that's been happening within the community since the 1990s. And we had conversations with the Jewish community. Historically, the government actually called these concentration camps in various documentation, even President Roosevelt and the Secretary of Interior Ickes all called it concentration camps. And then you start seeing different terms being used later on during the process. And so we just wanna, I just want to let you know this is why I'm using different conversations. And there's actually academics and documentation about it. So if you just Google power words, the Japanese American Citizens League, you can find a good summary of that. And then a lot of academics have been writing some sort of terminology blurb before their written work to discuss this as well. So let's have a quick overview about the Japanese American history, kind of leading up to the incarceration. But I'd like to always start here because, I am jumping around the timeline, but it's like, I like to just clarify that how did we get to this incarceration? In a 1982 congressional study, it said it was because of racism, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. And that's when there was a recommendation for an official apology. So I like going into that, letting you all know that that's what happened 40 years later after the fact, where the government did a review and said this was not correct. So, but let's kind of figure out how we got there. So we had people immigrating to the United States starting in the 1800s, coming in because, as you saw in the video, there was just some economic pressure due to the opening up of Japan through Commodore Perry and all of that. So we have people coming in starting as early as 1860s, but most of the way was in the late 1890s into the early 1900s. And as people are settling down and they're starting to create community, they're establishing themselves in the different areas up and down the West Coast. These images happen to be from the Seattle area. The left image is of a church group, and then the right image is just personal family photo where you could see that they bought a house and they're establishing themselves. And then as they're creating these communities, they're doing other social things. And as you can see, a lot of the community is staying intact within the Japanese American community. And a lot of that is because of the racism that was kind of going on, essentially redlining and whatnot of, hey, we want, folks to kind of not be in our neighborhoods. So what happens? You have a lot of these Japan towns popping up because they're finding security in numbers. And so the image on the left is actually a really cute image from the 1920s from the Valentine's Day dance. You can see all the ladies in their, haircut and flapper looking aspects. And then the image on the right is the Kogita family, just, they're eating rice balls. And I just love the kiddo on the right. That's actually a woman named Dorothy. She's like putting that giant rice ball in her mouth. But, as the community settled in, they're starting to thrive. They're becoming professionals, owning businesses. So the image on the left is, again, in the Seattle area where you have the Cascade Soda Water Company, and the gentleman on the right is actually the owner in front of the car. A lot of people, when I first show this image, people assume the guy on the left bottom is the owner, but you had Japanese American business people, and again, they're starting to maybe purchase homes, establish themselves, and creating their own community. We had people also like not being in the urban areas, going out to rural areas, doing farming and whatnot. This is an image of the Yasui family in Oregon. But we also had Japanese Americans who were like frontiersmen. So there's Mr. Yasuda, who's the man facing us. He was actually a frontiersman exploring Alaska, and he established the town of Beaver, Alaska. But also there's a mountain named after him. But then a lot more racial prejudice is starting to set in where people don't want Japanese Americans in certain areas, or they don't want Japanese American businesses, where you could see the bottom right image here. This is a San Francisco parade float in the 4th of July parade, and it literally says patronize white laundries only, anti-Jap laundry league. So you have a lot of the sentiment that was building up towards us, the United States, entering into World War II. So once you have the attack on Pearl Harbor, that's when the U.S. enters into war. And shortly afterwards, there's this executive order 9066 that was signed. And a lot of people, there's some confusion with this, because some people think because of this, it gave the government, it just targeted Japanese Americans for the incarceration. But just for clarity, this executive order basically said the military can exclude people from certain areas. They didn't specifically name Japanese Americans, but this was used to specifically target Japanese Americans. So what happened was they created these exclusion zones. And if you look at this map, you see that there's a heavy red line that kind of goes through half of Washington, half of Oregon, all of California, and the bottom third of Arizona. So that is the exclusion zone where Japanese Americans could not be in, and they were forcibly removed into other areas. And you could see that there's triangles indicated in several states. The big triangles are the 10 main camps that people went. So you could see Topaz in Utah. But if people were living on the right side of the line, they weren't incarcerated. So there was also a Japanese American community in the Salt Lake area that existed that weren't incarcerated, but people who were within that exclusion zone were forcibly removed. So a lot of the people who went to Topaz in Utah ended up coming from the California area, like Berkeley, San Francisco, and that was a huge arts community. So the folks at Topaz, there was actually a lot of art that was created out of Topaz. But when people are forcibly removed, they many only got days, maybe a week to kind of figure out what they're going to do. And so people didn't know what was going to happen. The government wasn't communicating with them saying, hey, we're going to take you into these incarceration camps. Like there was no communication. So people didn't know what to do with their belongings, if they should just like liquidate everything, have cash on hand, or if because there was an opportunity for folks to move inland. So, and that's where Erica is going to come in to talk about that aspect. But not many families did that because some didn't have places to go beyond that exclusion zone, or they didn't have family that they could go and be with. So there was a lot of complications. Or there are folks who started their journey to move beyond the exclusion zone, but they're facing a lot of racism and thought, well, maybe we should just go back and then get forcibly removed and see where that goes, because they thought that that may have been a little bit more safer than what they were engaging outside of their communities. So these notices were posted, and again, people only had a few days to kind of gather their belongings and figure things out. Again, here's a map where you could kind of look at all these different incarceration sites. So although a lot of people think about the 10 major camps that are, again, indicated by these black triangles, originally people weren't just moved into these camps. They were taken to these so-called assembly centers, which were temporary detention facilities up and down the West Coast before getting moved out to the 10 camps. And there's a whole story behind that, but I don't really have time for that. But if you do have questions, we could talk about it later or anything like that. And also, just want to let you know, I could send out the slides if you're interested, because I may be going through some of these slides really quickly. So this is an image of the first major removal of Japanese Americans, and this was at Bainbridge Island, Washington. There was a community of about like 300 folks on island, and the government was trying to figure out how are we going to move, thousands of people at a time. And so they used Bainbridge Island as a case study just to figure it out. So you could see folks getting forcibly removed. And then they actually brought in the National Guard from New Jersey to help assist with this removal. And I've heard stories from friends who were children at the time where they remember being carried by these guardsmen, and these guardsmen were crying because on the East Coast, since they're from New Jersey, they didn't see this anti-Japanese sentiment on the East Coast, and they couldn't understand what was really going on over here on the West Coast. But eventually they figured out the plan, started moving people. You start seeing people and imagery of people wearing tags. They had to wear this tag that had a family number. And this is where you start seeing the dehumanization of folks, where they were no longer referred to by their family name, but by a number. And so yeah, and a lot of people remember their number. Like I know my family number, it's 02572. And then each one of my family members was a letter. So my grandfather was A, my grandmother was B, and then going all the way down to P and Q because I had a really large family, and my uncle George was born in camp, and so I think he was Q. So yeah, that's just the realities of stuff. But you also had folks who served in World War One who was like defiance, like, you know what, I'm gonna wear my uniform when I'm getting called. You could see he has five stripes, on his forearm, and I think that yeah, and I can't remember his name right now. My brain is kind of freaking out. But yes, he's well documented as being a World War One veteran, and reported to these assembly center. This was specifically Santa Anita in California in his full uniform. And then when people start to go to the 10 War Relocation Authority camps, those triangles, the 10 major camps, this is what they came into. You know, there are signs that says, you know, there's sentry on duty. You have guard towers with guns pointing in, and people had to, you know, go in and out, and there was a army guard monitoring and tracking people's movements. And then, you know, it was again hard for some folks because, you know, seeing these guard towers, there's a fence line. When you look at the fence line, it's trying to keep people in rather than keeping people out. And there was this narrative that the government was using where it's like, we're trying to protect you. But if you're trying to protect people, shouldn't things go the other way? Like, shouldn't the guns being pointed outwards, or shouldn't the fence line try to prevent people from coming in, right? So there was a lot of psychological like trauma and damage that happened to folks, you know, just having this as your reality when, you know, at one point in time, you were living in your own space, but now you're starting to live in a communal lifestyle. These barracks that were created, they were hastily built. We have documentation from Wyoming that some of these crews, they only had 59 minutes to erect one of these barracks. And so a barrack would have between 5 to 6 units in it. And so at Minidoka it had 6 units, so you could have up to 6 families in this space. And they were utilizing green wood, so it'll shrink, so you'll get like the elements coming in because all you had was the wood and tar paper that's separating you from the elements from the outside. And again, it was hastily built, so you see that there was just a lot of dirt and you know, just a lot of soil out there. People complain about dust. People had really bad asthma reactions coming out into some of these camp areas. And then when it, you know, rained, it was like super muddy. But again, they're going into this communal lifestyle where they're eating as a whole block. So one block would have one mess hall. So up to 72 families will be eating there with you for lunch, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then this is an example of a barrack unit where this space was meant for a family of 6. And there was no dividers or anything like that. And historically, when people got into these barracks, they did not have the beaver board, as you could kind of see that there, it looks like there's a ceiling and that there are walls. That actually didn't exist until 3 years in, where they finally got materials to insulate better. So at first, it would just be the bare wood right there. And then those communal showers, again, they're going from living in an individual lifestyle to a communal lifestyle, which is hard for people to adjust. And then, yeah, so there's some images. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's it literally says, yes, property theft or damage is punishable under federal law. And these 2 folks are stealing this piece of wood to make some furniture. So I love it because I just think it's like so defiant. But those issues of, you know, people not having a lot to do, you know, they're becoming idle because the one of the issue was that the older population weren't allowed to participate in like the, you know, they're trying to set up local governance of the camps and everything, that they were barred from participating, and then they're barred from speaking Japanese and congregating large groups. So there was a lot of depression that happened. And we also had instances of suicide because, you know, people couldn't handle it. They lost everything. Um, but yeah, but sometimes people try to find other outlets like gardening here. Oops. This is actually a large garden at Minidoka. And so the family created this garden, and the gentleman on the left is actually the creator of this garden. And at the end of the camp experience, the government was going to ship people's personal properties back. And so the gentleman on the right, the white gentleman who's looking at the camera, he was an administrator. And so Mr. Kogita asked, hey, could you send me back my rocks? And the government actually shipped it. So you could actually see most of this in his son's front yard, which is kind of cool. So, but this is kind of like the life that they're living in, where, you know, it was just cold. The elements got really cold out in like Idaho, Utah, Wyoming. So it was a hard adjustment for folks, especially if they're from the coastal area. But life continued on. People got married, they had babies, but there was also deaths in camp as well. But kids being kids, they're also living their life. So when you talk to people about their experiences, it's going to be very different. Like the older generation had it a lot tougher. The younger kids, most of the conversations always like they had fun in camp, but it's all how they're processing it, right? Because especially the young adults who had to like who were challenged with their loyalty, I know was tough for them too. So you'll hear a variety of experiences. It doesn't mean that one is more correct than the other. It's just it shows the variety of experiences from this camp experience. Um, so yeah, so here are some just general daily life stuff that was happening in camp. And then we also had folks who served in the military. And I believe at Utah, I think it was about 1,000 men either volunteered or were enlisted and served this nation. Um, and also women were serving as well, but people also paid, the ultimate sacrifice where you see up in the upper right, there's an image of a funeral of a serviceman and his family, but the man passed away. He was killed in action in France. But there was a segregated unit called the 442, and they were basically, and they are still are the most decorated unit in the U.S. Army service. I was talking to an Army historian who believes that it'll take a generation or two for another unit to overtake the medal counts that the 442 and the 100th Battalion received. And then recently, in 2010, the Nisei soldiers were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest civilian honor out there. And then recently as well, there was a stamp that was honoring them as well for the U.S. Postal Service. But some folks, served in the military. There were actually some folks who resisted the draft as well because, there was this like it was tough for folks again, different different views where some people was like, we need to show our patriotism by enlisting. And other people was like, hey, I'm an American citizen. You can't incarcerate me and expect me to still serve all the duties of being a citizen and wanting to go get, drafted or enlist in the military. Like, give us back our freedom and we will act like Americans. But if you're not going to treat us as American citizens, why should we have to go? And then that led to mass trials. So you got folks who were who actually served federal sentences. This is actually the largest mass trial that occurred. It was in Wyoming, where I think it was like 50 folks um, were charged, and they served between 13 and 18 months in federal prison. So I don't know if you guys could see my pointer, but there's this gentleman right here. His name is Takashi Hosuzaki. He's still alive. He just turned 100 this year, but he was the youngest draft resistor, but he's also a veteran. So during World War II, he's like, give me back my freedom, and then I'll fight. But he didn't get it back. And so he served, I think it was 15 months in a federal penitentiary. And he said every day he felt bad because he was more comfortable in a federal penitentiary than when he was incarcerated at Heart Mountain at the War Relocation Authority camp. But during the Korean War, he had his freedom, he got drafted, and he served. So you have people who it's out of principle that they resisted the draft, but then they also served their nation because a lot of this came back down to what it means to be an American citizen. And that's what the government was challenging folks. But then some people got so upset that they're just like, you know what? Maybe I'll just renounce my citizenship and go back to a country I've never been to, And so you did have Japanese Americans who never been to Japan, who don't speak Japanese, decide to give up their citizenship under extreme duress and left. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of start ending this presentation where Mitsuya Endo Tsutsumi, she was incarcerated at Topaz. And she was the one that actually ended the incarceration. Those three other landmark cases that went up to the Supreme Court, but they failed. But Mitsuya Endo challenged the Supreme Court saying, I'm a U.S. citizen. I have brothers who are serving loyally in the U.S. military. She has never been charged with a crime or anything. And she challenged due process saying, you have not charged everyone with a crime or me with a crime. I haven't had my day in court. Give me my day in court or charge me with a crime. And so that's when the government was like, wow, okay, we're going to actually have to side with her. And then that's what actually led to the government preemptively saying that they're going to close the camps down the following year, because this was in 1944. So then it kind of mooted this um, the decision by the Supreme Court. But it was someone from Utah who helped get it. And earlier this year, she was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal, which is the second highest award for that the president could bestow on an individual. But with the closing of the camps, this is what people were coming home to still because of the anti-Asian sentiment that existed. This is kind of a story of my family. So this is my grandfather who served in the military intelligence service during World War II, but he couldn't find a job afterwards, even being a veteran, because no one wanted to, work with, a so-called JAP or and so my grandfather wanted to be his own boss, so he decided to be a door-to-door salesman, but no one wanted to then buy from a person like him. So he ended up doing professional wrestling because white wrestlers need an enemy to fight. So he had to put his personal pride aside, did a lot of stereotypical Japanesey things so he could put food on his table. And unfortunately, that led him to travel a lot where he wasn't around for my dad when he was growing up and stuff like that. But, people are just trying to survive. But then fast forward to the redress movement, President Roosevelt signed an apology in the Civil Liberties Act 1988. And then it comes back to the congressional study where I started earlier at the beginning. But it was determined that there was failure of leadership on all three branches at the executive level, the legislative, and the judicial level. And this is an image of a letter that President George Bush sent out to folks. And then the signing where you have Norman Netta on the left side, and then President Reagan. And then, yeah, so that's my end of the presentation. Sorry, I went a little bit long. I'm going to now pass it over to Erica to talk about her family's experience in Utah.
Thank you, Hanako. That was a deeply important and really hard to distill into 20 minutes presentation. So I appreciate that. I am now going to share. And hopefully we all have good juju for Zoom and everything goes swimmingly. So I'm going to tell the story of my family, the Naito family, who were able to avoid imprisonment in the camps by relocating to Salt Lake City. As you will see, avoiding the camps didn't mean avoiding trauma, scarring, lasting trauma that would ultimately drive Bill Naito, the second son and my grandfather, to become a larger-than-life figure in Portland and Oregon. First, a note about pronunciation. You heard Naito family and Bill Naito. Bill was born William Sumio Naito, but he changed the pronunciation in the 1950s to Naito. In Japanese, he was born with the written last name on the left in kanji, and it became the one on the right in katakana. It was a change that was partially pragmatic. Americans seem to have a harder time with Naito than Naito. But it was also a way for Bill to distinguish himself from his parents and to define himself on his own terms. It is not that Bill rejected being Japanese, but he struggled with the connection between traditional Japanese things and his mother, with whom he had a terrible relationship. Hide Naito, Bill's father, arrived in Portland in 1917, taking a very long route from Japan to England to New York to Oregon. I unfortunately do not have a picture of him young, so you'll just have to imagine him strapping young 15-year-old boy coming to America. He eventually worked in a fine Japanese import store, pictured here. When the owner decided to move back to Japan, Hide had saved enough money to buy it, renaming it H. Naito Gifts. He then wrote down to Los Angeles, where a young woman from his village, Fukie, had immigrated with her family, and he won her hand in marriage. Marriage quickly brought children. Sam in 1921, Bill, pictured in the portrait in 1925, and Albert in 1928. A traditional Japanese family, Hide left all the child rearing to Fukie while he concentrated on his business, working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Fukie concentrated all her attention on Sam, the Chunon, firstborn, leaving Bill and Albert to feel a surplus to requirements. And she seemed to have a genuine dislike for Bill, even at an early age. It gave him intense anxiety and self-hatred, saved only by school where he flourished and playtime with his classmates and neighbors. Hide had purchased their house on 58th and Burnside in the all-white Mount Tabor neighborhood, far from Nihon Machi, Portland's Japantown, in Old Town on the west side. He understood the hard reality that the easiest road to success in America is assimilation. And here is Sam with his Mount Tabor classmates. Sam was the first person of any color there, Bill the second and Albert the third. Sam felt, quote, white before Pearl Harbor, meaning fully accepted by white society and a member of it. Hide's business benefited from the roaring 20s, and his high-end Japanese import store did very well. In 1920, he shared a booth with other Japanese merchants at the Oregon State Fair. How ironic that the article begins, quote, Oregon is proud of its foreign-born citizens, when there had been rampant anti-German American activity because of the war, and 3 years later, the alien land law would prevent men like Hide from owning any property in the state. But Hide was a savvy and determined businessman and succeeded despite the bigotry. At the same time, international issues were starting to impose themselves locally in Portland. War crimes being committed in China by Imperial Japan resulted in highly disruptive picketing at Astoria's and Portland's ports. Oregonians voiced their support in letters to the editor, and the longshoremen joined the picket lines. Political cartoons started to feature grotesque caricatures of Japanese people, especially General Tojo with his distinctive glasses. Bill, a young teenager, started to wonder if that's how other people thought he looked. The atmosphere became increasingly toxic for the Japanese Americans who had nothing to do with the empire's actions. The editorial cartoon pictured on the right shows just how ludicrous the selective racism was. Whereas before, it was the Chinese drawing ire, and that resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now they were the good Asians and Japanese the bad. Then the worst happened. The Empire of Japan attacked the base at Pearl Harbor, launching the United States into World War II and triggering a series of unconstitutional events that would force the Nitos out of Oregon. The day after the attack, the FBI locked Hide out of his own store without a warrant, going through the accounting to find traces of collusion and treason. But there was nothing to find. Because like every other Japanese American, Hide was not a traitor. And I emphasize every other because there has never been evidence of a single act of treason by a Japanese American. Despite having his business reliant on trade with Japan, Hide hadn't participated in the Japanese-focused businesses or clubs that many Issei did. And Issei is what we refer to the first generation Japanese immigrants as. He never sent any money back to Japan or returned there even for a visit. The FBI's ABC list, which rank ordered the supposed dangerousness of Issei based on their community involvement, wouldn't have had Hide A, B, or C. Because of this, he was one of the lucky ones to avoid immediate illegal imprisonment in Missoula, Montana. But the Naito's life was still upended. The FBI came to the house on several occasions, going through it without a warrant and scaring Fukie with her extremely limited English to death. Portland immediately canceled Hide's business license the day after Pearl Harbor. Bill went around to their white neighbors and the local church to gather signatures of support. Shockingly, it worked, and his license was reinstated. But the reprieve was only temporary, as a month and a half later, City Council canceled all licenses permanently. Shortly after that, Executive Order 9066 forced the Japanese American community to leave the 500-mile wide exclusion zone with almost immediate effect. Bill kept a copy of the executive order on a column by his desk, never wanting to let people forget what had been done to him. He would never bring it up himself, but if someone asked about it, he would tell them stories of how deeply it hurt when he was forced to leave high school in the middle of the day.
I was in high school, and I made sure it was during class, because I didn't want to see any of my friends. And I emptied out my locker, took all my books, my gym clothes, home, and took the streetcar home, and then the following day we left town. And that was that's probably one day I'll never forget. That was a tearful day, tearful, and I just couldn't say goodbye to my parents. Why didn't you want to see them? Humiliation. That this kind of show that I was a traitor, couldn't be trusted and not American.
To Hide, imprisonment meant the end of everything that he had built. And I think there was a level of defiance against not the government, but being told that he was expected to behave a certain way. He was not going into a camp willingly. Fukie's sister-in-law was in Salt Lake City, outside the exclusion zone, and with an existing Japantown. And Hide used the self-relocation exemption in 9066 to move the family there. So while others arrived at the Portland Assembly Center and were ultimately forced into concentration camps, the Naito family checked in and then left, arriving in Salt Lake on almost bald tires. The government required that they take back roads, since they might do something like blow up Bonneville Dam on their way out of town. The Naitos were lucky in other ways most weren't too. Hide's white landlord for his shop and basement warehouse did not cancel his lease. He gave control of the shop over to a white woman who had worked in it for years. As long as she paid the rent, she was entitled to any profits beyond that. Using guardianship as a workaround for alien land laws, Hide had bought their home in Sam's name, so they were able to rent it out for a small sum while they were away. And they had white neighbors to keep an eye on it. Unlike most Japanese Americans, like the one pictured here, the white people that the Naitos relied on kept their promises. Salt Lake was a welcome change to Bill. He didn't have to face his friends in Portland every day, or the trauma of the loss of their store and violation of their home. In Salt Lake, he could start over as well as one could. His father, on the other hand, was so devastated that he couldn't find motivation to do anything but sulk. Hide was a merchant. He was not a farmer, as many Issei were, and his merchant business had been wholly reliant on trade with Japan. Bill found a solution to give him purpose: chicken farming. Bill had been in 4-H and had taught himself chicken husbandry in high school. Bill suggested that the family do it for a living. One of the most ironic aspects of their relocation to Salt Lake was that when hens stopped laying, they would slaughter them and sell their meat to a local restaurant, the wildly racist Coon Chicken Inn, which was so successful that it had franchises in Seattle, Washington, and back home in Portland, Oregon. Sam applied to the University of Utah in order to finish his undergrad studies. A man named Ralph Green wrote into the Chronicle, responding to a proposal by the University of California's president that colleges outside of the exclusion zone should give free tuition to Japanese American students. Green was offended at the notion, ending with the question, quote, "Why should the bad boy be given a quarter after having been spanked for his behavior?" Sam responded with his own editorial in the Chronicle, noting that 99% of forcibly removed Japanese American students were American citizens. In the end, he said, quote, All we ask is a chance to prove our loyalty, not by lip service, but by action. And especially prove that we are not, quote, bad boys and, quote, unwanted and unneeded material, to quote Green's editorial. Salt Lake had become the center of Japanese American advocacy, being the closest city to the exclusion zone that had an existing Japanese American community. Sam became a member of the JACL Relocation Aid Committee, with goods including clothes and books sent to the Tanforan Relocation Center. Sam also worked to develop a program to help those who relocated obtain employment and housing. Bill worked as a greens boy to get additional income for the family while he attended Granite High School. Upon graduation in 1944, his only plan was to enlist. His parents supported him, feeling that the country had given them and their boys so many opportunities that it was only fair. Bill wanted to be in the Navy, but Japanese Americans were only allowed in a segregated Army unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit. But a placement exam put him into the Military Intelligence Service instead of the battlefields in Europe. When the U.S. dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Bill was in transit in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So instead of serving in active warfare, he performed censorship duties in occupied Japan. While serving, he was able to visit with his extended family, and he found some happiness in helping a young man get into college in America. But it was almost as devastating to him as expulsion from Portland. America had made it clear that he was not an American, and the Japanese, while kind, clearly didn't consider him Japanese. Did anyone want him? Did he belong anywhere? He was afraid of the future, especially about how white people would react to him once he returned home. Could he still call Portland home? All that introversion and anxiety from his difficult childhood were magnified to oppressive levels by the war. Bill eventually returned to Portland, using the GI Bill to attend Reed College, a small elite liberal arts school in the city. At first, he was, in his own words, pathologically shy. But a professor and a group of white students who became close friends helped to open him up. After graduating Phi Beta Kappa with a degree in economics, he moved to Illinois to attend the University of Chicago for a master's in the subject. He remained the highly successful student he had always been, but it felt empty. He didn't feel much purpose to what he was doing. In truth, Bill was still that isolated, hurt little Nisei boy felt unwanted and adrift. And Nisei is what we refer to second-generation Japanese Americans. His parents had wounded him badly with their favoritism of his brother Sam, and his mother's disdain for him was tantamount to abuse. Her rejection of him left him with a severe stuttering at times and partial paralysis on the right side of his face, giving him a crooked smile. The racism of World War II had deepened all those negative feelings inside him. He would have remained that way, but for a white friend suggesting a psychological seminar on the acculturation of minorities. It included 4 times a week therapy sessions for 2 years. They revolutionized his way of thinking, allowing him to control his emotions and to look upon his family with more empathy. He felt optimism for the first time in his life, having long believed that he had some fatal, irreversible flaw, but realizing now it was circumstance, not character. This laid the foundation for a man who would change Portland permanently, sometimes through sheer force of will. Over the years that followed, Bill and his brother Sam would take their father's retail and wholesale business and turn it into a real estate and retail empire. Bill was involved in dozens of civic endeavors that would shape Portland for decades to come. But there was never enough success, never enough notoriety. He, like his father before him, left almost all the child rearing to his wife Mickey while he focused almost entirely on his business and growing his importance to Portland and Oregon's mostly white population. You see, Bill was motivated by vengeance. He was angry about what had been done to him, about how white society had rejected and betrayed him. And he was going to make sure they knew it. How? By being the best businessman, the best civic leader, the best Portlander that they knew. He was going to make them choke on regret for having ever doubted him. But he would never let them know. He was going to smile his way through it. I want you to compare this picture with what he told his therapist in 1980 in a follow-up to the psychological seminar that he did back in Chicago. Quote, I feel like I should take punishment as a samurai would, with a smile. There are these bastards out there trying to do us in, and I go out there and fight these bastards like a samurai. It actually gives me strength to accomplish what I do. But Bill was also proving it to his parents that he was the best of their sons, and to prove it to himself. After all, he referred to his own life story as a little Japanese boy comes good. And having both his family and the nation tell him that he was bad and unworthy was a wound that never healed. Out of all of his successes, it was the Japanese American Historical Plaza on Portland's waterfront that he considered, quote, the only important thing I've ever done, because it was to memorialize the wrong that had been done, but also to memorialize the strength of the Japanese American community and how it represented the best of America. Bill and his family were not incarcerated, but he felt the suffering of his community acutely as if he had been there and borne witness. We call it vicarious trauma, which was brought to public awareness after George Floyd's murder. With the plaza, Bill sought to vindicate and elevate every Japanese American in Oregon, not just himself. Despite being a multimillionaire real estate mogul and one of the most famous Oregonians of his time, Bill guided tours through the plaza, helping visitors to understand what he and his community had endured. It was what he had been missing his entire life, and was only possible because of all the connections and goodwill that he had built throughout his career. It was as if it had been leading to this memorial all along, a permanent retort to the wicked racism that had made him feel so small 50 years before. Bill died relatively young at 70 years old in 1996. He had worked himself to death, disproving white society's belief that he wasn't good enough, his heavy drinking a contributing factor to the multiple cancers that killed him. Some traumas are too hard to survive without a salve. He knew he was dying, and so he was able to decide the details of both his funeral and the memorial, including the pamphlet that was handed out at the memorial. He made sure it included the Bill of Rights, the very document that the U.S. government had betrayed in World War II, and the one that he sought to defend his entire life, so that others would not suffer as he had. Thank you. Stop share here. There we go.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Hanako, both for your presentations. That was very insightful, and thank you for sharing your own personal family stories as well.